Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And a few weeks ago, my guest gave a fabulous presentation about the 106th Division and especially the 423rd Regiment in the Ardennes. We touched on other campaigns as well. And we also mentioned in kind of passing the topic of today's show. But today, Brian returns to share the POW experience of the men captured in the Ardennes. His book, Boys, Just Boys, is linked in the description below. I urge you to go and get it because it's people like Brian who are doing this granular work that don't have the big publishers behind them. They don't get to go to the big conferences and things. It's their work that needs supporting. So I urge you to make sure people like Brian get supported. So he'll be encouraged to write more books and more people will see Brian's success and more people get books. And basically we end up with more and more books, which is what we want. So good afternoon, Brian. How are you today?
I am well. Good afternoon.
So we were just discussing before going on, the whole POW experience, and we're going to get into this presentation about men captured in December 1944, who, I'm going to use a quote, that only had to spend a few months as prisoners of war. Which, from my British perspective, lots of British people in the audience, we all know tales of the guys captured at Dunkirk and after that who spent 5 years in the bag. And I think a question came up already from Roderick saying, what was the POW experience harsher at the end of the war than at the beginning? And I think when we get through today's presentation, we will definitely say, and by some metrics, the POW experience was worse at the end of the war. The Germans are running out of everything. And so, chronicling, as you did a unit like this, people, they do want to hear about the battles. They do want to hear about the campaigns and all that. But do people kind of roll their eyes a bit at the POW experience? How easy is it to kind of to get people interested in that chapter? Because it's not a sorry chapter. It's part of the story, but it hasn't got the kind of the triumph of being part of a battle and getting a victory.
Yeah, well, for me, the POW experience was just as interesting as the combat of it. I started out that last presentation by telling you I believe that the 106th experience was unique in terms of the last infantry division, the youngest, the least trained, went from Camp Atterbury 45 days later is in the middle of the Bulge. And I believe that their POW experience was equally as unique to the other divisions in Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll fire up your PowerPoint, and folks, the score, fire away with questions. I'll sure jump in with some comments as well. And this is an experience of that perhaps we should know a bit more about. It's that we've been talking a lot about the crossing of the Rhine, this chapter there, but people they lose a bit of attention when it gets to after the Ardennes, before the E-Day. So we're filling in some of this vital information with this presentation. So over to you, sir.
All right. So like I said, I believe the 106 POW experience was unique. And I think by the end, perhaps many of you will agree. So we ended the last presentation. We ended it with the 106 being disorganized back in October of 1945. However, after the battle, you can see on this map here where it says 423rd and 424th. On the 19th, about 4:30 in the afternoon, the two regiments were captured. Most of the men of the 423rd were taken to Blyth, where they spent the night of the 19th in the center of the town. The church was there. They stayed in the courtyard. They stayed in the church. Keep in mind, it's below freezing. These men haven't had a warm meal since the dinner of on the 15th of December. The 424th and along with the 2nd Battalion of the 423rd, a lot of those men were taken to All, where they were put in barns and just in open fields and fenced-in areas. The next day, the men were marched about 20 miles to the east. You can see where they left Blyth. Right in the middle of that column where it dips is Prüm. Now, the men from All came from the north. They all went through Prüm, and they went to a town called Gerolstein. And at Gerolstein is where the Germans loaded them up on the rail cars. And I don't read or speak French, but I'm told, Paul, 40 men or 8 horses. These are the rail cars that the men were packed into. This is a picture from the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson depicting the POWs getting into the cars. This is a better depiction. This is one at the Holocaust Museum in DC, because you can see the openings on the front. And if you look through the door, you can see that opening in the back. This is what the men described that they had in the rail cars. Now, keep in mind, these were designed for 40 men to move comfortably. No less than 65, sometimes in excess of 70 men were packed into these rail cars. There were so many men, they couldn't all sit down at the same time. Now it's the 20th. It's been over 5 days since they've had food. Many of the men have dysentery. I've heard many stories, read the journals, memoirs, where the men would use their steel pots as a toilet and have to pass it to the man who was by the window to dump out the window. This is Don Cooley, one of the POWs. There's a picture that from before the war. This was when he was ASTP at, I think it was at Alabama or Auburn. And there you see the picture of him afterwards. Mr. Cooley was a clerk in 1st Battalion, and he had one of these notepads, and he took a list of all the men. And this is goes over several pages. And there are 68 men on this list. He did this list on Christmas Day. So you can just imagine, he's sitting in this rail car. It's Christmas Day. And I'm going to tell you something that happened before Christmas Day. But he's 19 years old, and he has the wherewithal to say, hey, how about if everybody in here write down your name and address?
Wow.
So from Gerolstein, the train went about 70 miles to the east to Limburg. And at Limburg, I believe the plan was for the Germans to offload the POWs at Stalag 12A. However, the camp was, there was no room for them. The train got to Limburg it was actually Diez, is a small town just south of Limburg. That's where the railyard is. And they sat there. They got there on the 20th, and they just sat there, locked in their cars. Still no food, no water. Some men are licking condensation off the metal on the inside of the rail cars. So the men are in, and I cut the date off here, it appears. So the men are in the rail cars. It's about 4:30 p.m. on December 23rd. Sitting there freezing, they're hungry. And all of a sudden they hear the drone of aircraft, and then flares are dropped in the rail yard. These were pathfinders of the RAF, and the RAF actually bombed the rail yard. You can see, I don't know if you can see it real well. It looks like a little model train set with the rails that are just lifted off the ground. You can see some of the craters there. The men talked about the rail cars were literally bouncing off the ground. From the impact of the bombs. Some of the men were locked in the cars, couldn't get out. Others, doors were open somehow, and they ran into the open fields. Surprisingly, only 8 men in those trains died. They were represented from the 422nd, 423rd of the 106th. The 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion was attached to the 106. There's a few men in there who I have not been able to figure out what units, but I think it's miraculous that only 8 men died.
And just worth mentioning, sorry to interrupt you, Brian, is that when we had Dr. Philip Blood on a year or so ago talking about the railroads and importance of them to the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge, because we all have the image of, Robert Shaw in the King Tigers from the Battle of the Bulge movie and all that, but the tail was railyard, and with all the weather being crap, the 9th Air Force couldn't operate over the actual battlefield, but the weather was better further kind of east, I guess, towards the heart of Germany, where the reinforcements are coming from. So as the poor 423rd and other units were victim of, this is when the RAF and everybody else are going hell for leather to try and stop reinforcements going up to reinforce the thrust. At this point is still, it's kind of run out of steam, but there's still potentially a push towards Antwerp. So it's the Battle of the Bulge is also an aerial battle of the rail yards, which is worth mentioning, I think.
Yeah, and I'd have to believe that some of those cars were for military purpose, because I don't understand how only 8 men died. And if you see the destruction, that was an actual photograph of, I believe it was taken by Allies shortly after the bombing. So I told you Diez is just south of Limburg, and actually Stalag 12A. And although I haven't been able to pinpoint, there's nothing out there that I can find that tells you exactly where 12A was. It was north of Limburg. Unfortunately, one of the planes dropped a bomb in Stalag 12A, and it hit a barracks. And that barracks was full of American POWs. 47 officers were killed, and 3 enlisted men died. This photograph, Karl Worters, I mentioned before, he's a Belgian who's the premier expert on the 106. He sent me these pictures, and he actually shared these pictures with a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Clements, who was an A Company of the 424th, who was there. And there's a chance he's one of those Americans in the photograph that's going through the debris at 12A. Here's the list of the men who died. 3 of them were doctors. The first one on the list is actually a British officer, and there are 2 other British officers on the list. Some of the men, there was nothing left of them. They found dog tags. It was actually a lieutenant from the 423rd, a dentist named Piazza, who went, and he's the one who made this list, who was charged with coming up with the list of the POWs. So from Diez or Mühlberg, the POWs primarily went to 2 places. They went in many places, but the 2 POW camps that they primarily went to were Stalag 4B in Mühlberg, and that was still over a 200-mile trip. Now, keep in mind, you have military trains, munition trains of the Germans heading west. So every time these trains, they would have to get on the side. These train rides took quite a while to get to their destination. They arrived towards the end of December, beginning of January at Stalag 4B. This is a photograph, obviously, with the Germans from before its liberation. Here's a photograph taken. This is from the guard tower going down the main avenue. And on the right, I'm going to mention it a couple times. That's the shower facility where the men were deloused and given a hot shower shortly after they arrived. And here's Don Cooley again. Mentioned Don Cooley because when he was going through the shower, he's in line to go through the shower, and a British soldier comes through the line and tells the men in line, say, hey, if there's anything you want to keep that you don't want the Germans to confiscate, give it to me and I'll give it to you on the other end. Mr. Cooley was skeptical, but he had nothing to lose. Either the Germans got it or he would lose it to this British soldier. But sure enough, when he got out the other side, the camera he gave to this British soldier gave him his camera back. Mr. Cooley kept the camera throughout while he was a POW, has many photos. But this is a photograph that he took of Stalag 4B looking towards the gate. You can see the gate in the back, and it's not the greatest picture. It was shot from the hip because you couldn't just hold the camera up and take a picture. But Mr. Cooley is the gentleman on the left of that group of POWs. So although Stalag 4B wasn't, in terms of the amount of men who died from malnutrition, wasn't the worst. There were some who died. This was the first man to die from the 106. His name was Robert Chase. He died on February 3rd of 45, just a month after he got there. He died of pneumonia. But this is a picture I found in his IDPF file in St. Louis, and you can see you have the Americans there standing next to the grave, and you have the German contingent there. And if I had to guess, that was a British chaplain who was presiding over the burial. So here is, this is just a photograph. And again, when I did that first section, I went in chronological order. I'm not going in chronological order for the POW experience. I'm just doing each camp. This is the front of Stalag 4B after it was liberated. It was liberated by Soviet soldiers riding up on their on horseback, shooting the locks off the gate and galloping down the main thoroughfare. It was liberated on April 25th of 45. This is Francis Xavier Parkinson. I met with Mr. Parkinson several times at his home in Bella Vista, Arkansas. He was in B Company of the 423rd. He was an NCO, so he stayed at Stalag 4B his entire time as a POW. I don't know if any of you have seen this. Actually, I saw one in Dunkirk. There's a picture of this at the museum in Dunkirk, Paul. I don't know if you've seen it.
I've been to the museum. I don't remember seeing that.
Yeah, this is a bird's eye view of Stalag 4B. So when I went to visit Mr. Parkinson, he had this hanging on his wall. And he told me the story. He was playing cribbage one day with a British friend, and this guy comes walking in. The guy's name was Uchtman. He was a Dutch POW. I think he was a civilian. He wasn't military. And he unrolls this sketch, and he says to Mr. Parkinson, when I'm done with this, would you like a copy of it? And Mr. Parkinson says, sure, and writes down his name and address. But 3 years later, Mr. Parkinson got a postcard in the mail, and I've been able to purchase one off eBay. I have one. It said, if you send $3 and some odd cents to this bank in New York, I'll send you this picture of Stalag 4B. And if you look in the lower right, that is Uchtman's depiction of all the different nationalities that were captured there. When Mr. Parkinson said the camp was liberated, he said it sounded like what he imagined it would sound at the Tower of Babel, all the different languages being spoken. And if you look, I can't see it. I have something blocking it, but in the lower right-hand corner is where that shower facility is. The only thing left from Stalag 4B right now in Mühlberg, I went there in 2013, that main thoroughfare is there, and some of the foundations for some of the buildings are there. There's a Soviet cemetery to the northwest of the camp today. So this is one, Mr. Uchtman somehow had a camera and he took photographs, and that was one way I think he was able to get the details that he had of the POW camp. But this is one of the postcards he took. This was a picture he took that he turned into a postcard, and he has writing down at the bottom, and he sold these. These are French POWs leaving the camp, because after the Soviets liberated the camp, they did not want to let the British and American soldiers go right away. All the other nationalities left, but it took a while to get the British and the American POWs back to American lines. Keep in mind, 4B is east of the Elbe River. It's very near Dresden.
Ian T looked up on Wikipedia. 4B had prisoners from 33 different nations, according to the internet, which is wow. I'd struggle to even name 33 countries that would have had participants in that part of the world. But yeah, talk about a League of Nations.
Well, I would suspect maybe, you've got 15 Soviet.
Yeah, that'd be England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Rhodesia, Netherlands, Belgium. Yeah, but it's still amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, he said it was interesting. So under the Geneva Convention, privates could be made to work. And from Stalag 4B, there were dozens and dozens of arbeidskommandos that were sent out to work. The smallest one I'm aware of was 10 men, but one of them was 150 men. And these are 6 of the men of one of the arbeitskommando of 150 men that were sent to Dresden. You've got on the upper left, you have Kurt Vonnegut, the author of Slaughterhouse 5. You have Fred Parks. This is Jim Mills, the upper right. On the lower left is Edward Crone. On the bottom is James Donini. I believe I spoke about him on the first presentation. He has his AST patch on. And on the left is Michael Palea. He was a 19-year-old kid from Philadelphia. So the men are sent to Dresden. And when they first get to Dresden, they're sent to Dresden on January 10th of 45. And when they get to Dresden, they're cleaning up the streets. Some are working in some factories. There was a barley malt factory where they make a syrup for pregnant women. Some are working there. However, on February 13th, 14th, and 15th, the British and the Americans bomb Dresden. They firebomb it. There were some errant bombs that hit close to the slaughterhouse. The slaughterhouse was on the north side of town. Not a whole lot of damage there. The men were in a cellar. They could feel the calcium was falling off the ceiling while they were in the bomb shelter. However, after the bombing, their job changed substantially. Now these 150 men were charged with retrieving the dead Germans. Whether it's the Americans or the British, they mastered the art of firebombing. They would come in with the heavy bombs, knock holes in the roofs, blow out the windows, and then the fire bombs would come in. It's estimated that the firestorm created winds in excess of 90 miles an hour. And when the Germans sought shelter in the cellars, they didn't die from shrapnel, or they didn't burn. It wasn't smoke inhalation. That this fire sucked the oxygen out of the cellars, and it was almost an instantaneous death. So when these men would go into the cellars, these Germans were just sitting on the benches, some holding children, and they were charged with taking them out, piling them on pyres, and it's that's the backbone of Vonnegut's book of what these men had to go to. And I'm not going to get into the details. Where after weeks, some of the bodies were rotting. The smell, they would pull on bodies, and the body parts they would pull arms off. So after the bombing, the Germans moved the 150 men to a small community just outside of Dresden called Wolfnitz. And there was a British POW camp. And it's my understanding the Brits weren't too happy that they had it relatively comfortable, but now you're bringing in 150 filthy Americans, and they made the best of it. When they would go into the cellars, they were warned, don't take any food. It was seen as plundering, and it was a war crime. Michael Palea, the 19-year-old kid from South Philly, one day was in a cellar and he couldn't resist. He took a jar of beans, a canned beans that were stored in the cellar. He was caught. He was court-martialed, found guilty. 3 days later, Germans come to the camp, get 4 of his friends. They drive the friends to this military camp just north of Dresden across the Elbe. There they get out, and there comes Michael Palea, and a Soviet soldier marched in, and Michael and that Soviet soldier were executed. His 4 friends, it was done on the other side of a berm. Some Soviet soldiers had already dug a grave. His 4 friends had to go get his body, put it in the grave, and his body's never been found. He was never, there have been efforts, but he's still over there. I spoke with his brother several years ago, and Michael had an industrial accident. He worked for Pepsi, and he dropped a container on his foot. He had this limp. He had a little gimp. He didn't have to join the service, and he did. And he told me when his parents got word of his death, that his father just banged his head on the table, said, "Why did you go? You didn't have to go." The man on the right is Edward Krohn. Eventually, the Germans took now there's 149 men. The Soviets are getting close. The Germans start marching them south. But by this time, a few days earlier, Edward Krohn was put in the hospital. From all accounts, from the men I spoke with, he just gave up. And he died of malnutrition in the hospital. Now, Edward was given a military funeral at a cemetery just a short distance from where Michael was executed. And his body was brought back home after the war. So the men are marched, those 150 men are marched down towards the Czech border to a small town called Hellendorf. And at Hellendorf, they're sitting around, not doing a whole lot. Eventually, the Germans start marching them. They're in these columns of refugees, of thousands and thousands of refugees. And eventually 8 of them take out on their own. They commandeer this wagon. If you look at the picture on the right behind the horse, the second man, that's Kurt Vonnegut. 2 men over with what appears to be the T-shirt is Mr. Donini. And on the right pictures. Mr. Donini's there sitting there eating. Bernard O'Hare, who is one of Vonnegut's friends, is on the far right front. If you look over Bernard's head, you can see the profile of Kurt Vonnegut looking off into the distance. Eventually, these men took the wagon. They went back to Dresden, and eventually they worked their way east. The Soviets were very helpful to them. You can see that the Soviets advised them to paint the star on the side of the wagon, and on the back of it, it says USA. So the other major group of POWs went to Stammlager 9B in Bad Orb. Right in the middle, where you could see which shows the distance, that's Frankfurt. So we're just a little northeast of Frankfurt. This is a picture of Stalag 9B. Through postcards from the 19-teens and the 1920s, when it was a day camp, from an Army Signal Corps newsreel and from rudimentary maps that the POWs made, and with the help of Carl Worters, again, I've labeled every barracks that is there at 9B. And the only significance is that there's a roster at the National Archives that lists the men by barracks.
Wow.
So you're able to see which barracks they were in. And I can't see it here because I have something blocking, but on the very bottom, can you see it, Paul, where it says Barracks 32 Jewish Barracks?
I'll put my glasses on.
Okay.
Yep. Right at the bottom.
Okay.
Yep.
So let me see. This is the command staff. This, if I go back, if you go to you see the red, where the red barracks was up there to the north of that photograph was taken on the far right. That's where the Germans, that was their barracks. This is Edward, Stalag 9B, unlike 4B, there are a lot of men who passed away. This is Edward Hudson. He was the first man to die. He died January 25th of 45. He died of basically malnutrition. I can't remember if it was pneumonia or heart failure. On the right is the list. There was a Dr. Sutherland there who stayed behind, and he made the list. And Mr. Hudson was the first man to die. This is George Thompson. 38 men died at Stalag 9B, 35 of them from malnutrition. He was a 19-year-old kid from Watertown, Wisconsin. The camp was liberated on April 2nd. He died April 1st. The other three men who died, there was a dogfight going on over Stalag 9B. 3 Americans were chasing a German, and for some reason, the German dove towards the camp. The American shot at the German, and 3 Americans died. I believe they were from I know at least 2 of them were from the 28th ID, the 110th Infantry Regiment.
And just to interrupt just quickly, Brian, it's we talked in the first show, and we've talked with other guests about the divisions that are raised later in the war, that they received arguably the best training, the fitness regimes are very good. To die of malnutrition really just weeks after being theoretically at the peak of physical fitness just shows you how quickly the human body can lose all its strength. And it makes me wonder, those people who survived the Holocaust brutalities for 5 or 6 years, just how much perseverance they had to go. So people that, because we know we've done shows about people who are moved from Dachau to Auschwitz, then on again to Ravensbrück or something, and some of these people were in captivity for years and yet managed to survive. It's a testament to sometimes how incredibly resilient the human body can be, and yet also in these cases how quickly very fit young men can just die of malnutrition. As I say, weeks after being in good condition.
So there's something about cigarettes too, and I wasn't going to get into that, but cigarettes were king in POW camps. And Edward Crone, the man from the slaughterhouse who died at the hospital, Gifford Doxey was a man who actually went to college with Edward Crone before the war, and he was good friends with Edward Crone. And for whatever reason, Edward Crone would trade his food for cigarettes. Many of these men, I read, in diaries and Even at 9B where the NCOs were, which I'll talk about later, there was this love of cigarettes, and they would trade food just to have cigarettes.
Wow. Then that's an insight into addiction and coping with stress, because I know people who smoke when they are at their most vulnerable, they're most stressed, and they increase their what I love about this channel is these illuminations of the human psyche, of what different people do in adversity. It's truly amazing, and you're being congratulated in the sidebar for your incredible research and the human stories. So yeah, brilliant show. And back to you, Brian.
So this is a still photograph. So the I think the actual liberation is a reenactment of the liberation of Stalag 9B. It looks staged. I'm pretty sure it's staged. This isn't. This is the funeral procession there are two men in this funeral procession. One is George Thompson, who was the last man to die, and I just had a slip of who the other man was. But there's an actual full Signal Corps movie of this funeral procession. They are leaving the American section. The entire street was lined with the American soldiers during this funeral procession. There are four men on the wagon. I believe, forgive me here, I believe it's Chaplain Neal from the 106th. He's leading this procession. The four men on the wagon and the 8 men behind him were all from his company, H Company of the 423rd. But they start their funeral procession, go out the back gate, past where the German soldiers' barracks was, and they bury Mr. Thompson and the other gentleman. Forgive me, I forgot his name. So Stalag 9B, it had the privates, it had officers, and it had NCOs. Geneva Convention says you can't keep them all together. On January 10th, the officers left Stalag 9B for Hammelburg, for Oflag 13B in Hammelburg. At Hammelburg, I'm not aware of it, and this goes to your point that we were talking about earlier about the age of men, the experience. I'm not aware of any officer who died of malnutrition. I don't, they may have had some better rations, but it couldn't have been much, if any. So they get to Oflag 13B. There's Serbians there. There's British soldiers there. These are the first Americans there. I can see my writing at the top got off a little bit. On the left is Lieutenant George Vareem. He was in the 106th Cav. Throughout the day, just about every day, air raid sirens would go off. When an air raid siren went off, you had a very short time to get to the barracks. And while the air raid siren was going off, which could be in excess of 10 hours, you had to stay in the barracks. And there were no bathroom facilities in the barracks. Lieutenant Vareem on January 25th of 45 apparently wasn't moving quick enough, and he was shot in the back. He didn't die instantly. He was taken to the hospital run by the Serbians, and he died. Something interesting happened at Oflag 13B. When they first got there, Colonel Cavender, the 423rd, was the highest ranking officer. He was in charge. Things were going relatively well. But in March, there was, I believe it was March 7th, there was a group of POWs, 450 of them, that came from Oflag 64 in Poland. The Soviets were coming, the Germans moved them. They had hundreds and hundreds of miles. I don't know the exact, I can't off the top of my head the exact distance, hundreds of miles in blizzards without food and water. And they marched to Oflag 13B. When they got there, the leader was a Colonel Good, and Colonel Good outranked Colonel Cavender, so he took charge of Oflag 13B. One of the men also in that group was Lieutenant Colonel Waters, who was George Patton's son-in-law. Colonel Good negotiated with the commandant that, listen, when these air raid sirens go off, many of these men have dysentery, they have to go to the bathroom. And he negotiated with the commandant that 30 minutes after an air raid siren went off, one man from each barrack was allowed to go to the bathroom. On March 25th, I believe it was, Lieutenant Weeks, the siren went off. 30 minutes later, Lieutenant Weeks, who was the legal officer for the 423rd, he leaves the barracks to go to the bathroom. Now, keep in mind, when there's air raid sirens going off, the other POWs in the barracks, everybody's looking out the window because they want to catch a glimpse of a B-17 flying high in the sky heading to Berlin. So all the windows were full of officers. And Lieutenant Weeks, there's accounts, there's affidavits from the incident of him walking out of the barracks with his hands in his pocket, whistling. He's walking down the main street. Let me back up a minute. So Colonel Good negotiates with the commandant, and the commandant says, okay, Colonel Good told his staff that they were going to be allowed to go to the bathroom. However, Colonel Good waited 3 days before he told the rest of the men because he wanted to make sure that all the guards were aware of this new rule. And every day he asked the commandant, they're updated, right? All the guards know. So this is 3 days after they negotiate this. Lieutenant Weeks is walking down the main road, hands in his pocket, whistling. He stops at a water fountain and he's shot square in the back of the neck, drops, he dies instantly. You had inner guards and you had outer guards. Apparently all the inner guards were well aware of the rule. An outer guard who didn't have the authority to shoot into the camp. There are eyewitness accounts of this guard outside the fence going into this guard shack, getting a rifle, leveling it, and shooting Lieutenant Weeks. So those are the only 2 men that I'm aware of, only 2 men who died, officers who died at Oflag 13B. So I mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Waters. So the bomb task force, some of you might be aware of.
Yeah, we've done a show on it, and yeah. An interesting chapter, shall we say?
Well, it was quite miraculous that they were able to get to Oflag 13B without incident. Oflag 13B was 60 miles behind the German lines. They made it there. They liberated the camp. Ironically, and I have a book from Colonel Waters, when this American task force was heading into Hammelburg, Lieutenant Colonel Waters, another American, and a German went down to meet the task force. Well, one of the scouts ended up shooting Lieutenant Colonel Waters. He shot him in the rear. So they took him back. The camp is liberated. There are a lot more officers there than they had planned. The task force leaves. Many are riding on vehicles. Others are having to walk. Others said, the heck with this, I'm just staying here. And they leave. And it was a debacle. I'll have to watch your your program on the bomb task force, but it was basically wiped out.
Yeah, I mean, it was Don Fox, who's a historian for the 4th Armored Division, and he didn't mince his words about the planning or lack of planning that went into it. It's there are plenty of Patton fans who watch the channel, but whatever you think of Patton, this is not his finest hour at all. It was a clusterfuck, I think is the word I would use as a limey, but yeah, well intended but badly. And I'm glad you're carrying on the story, because I've never really seen it from the prisoner's point of view. I've heard of it. I've always heard of it from the point of view of the armored task force, and so I'm glad you're filling in another side of the story.
So the men were excited. Here's another picture of them greeting there. Many of the men who stayed behind. So the Germans evacuated. The commandant and the guards evacuated. However, when the task force left, many of the men who were left were in the hospital. They couldn't walk. Others stayed behind just to care for them. When the commandant came back, they evacuated the camp. And this column eventually made it to Nuremberg. And one day when they're in Nuremberg, they stop for a rest, and they see off in the distance about 6 miles away a wave of B-17s bombing. And then they see a second wave bombing that's closer. The third wave comes and they're bombing right over them. Several of the men were killed. Colonel Cavender was wounded. I can't remember if it was a tree or a piece of wood that went into his leg. But again, if all of these men would have just stayed at Oflag 13B, a lot of men would not have died. Because you got to figure, not only did men from the bomb task force, POWs who went on the bomb task force, die, many of the men from the task force died as a result of this. So the officers left Stalag 9B, the NCOs left Stalag 9B. The NCOs went to Ziegenheim, Stammlager 9A. This is a picture of William Buzzier, who I mentioned in the first program, who was very helpful in total recall. He kept a journal while he was a POW. The NCOs left Stalag 9B on January 25th. So the officers left January 10th. The NCOs left January 25th. A couple interesting things from Stalag 9A. I'm only aware of one man who died of malnutrition at Stalag 9A, but for those who were particularly Americans in the United States Army, this is a picture of William Bainbridge. The picture on the left is him as a POW, and I believe this picture most likely would have been taken by one of the men. Mr. Buzzier commandeered a camera, and I'm sure other men had a camera from the German barracks. This was probably a picture that was taken after, but that's William Bainbridge. And at any given time, there was only one sergeant major of the United States Army, the highest enlisted man in the United States Army. And Mr. Bainbridge went on to become the 5th Sergeant Major of the United States Army. And I'm going to talk about a few men also who, although weren't in the 106, were contributed to the story of the 106. This is Captain Stanley E. Morgan. He arrived to Stammlager 9A February 27th of 1945. He was in the 506 PIR of the 101st Airborne. He was captured on D-Day and he escaped. Then he jumped in Market Garden and he was captured. I don't know exactly what happened to him since from September of 44 until February, but he arrived at Stalag 9A on, like I said, in February of 45. And many of the men who kept journals and other men who I talked to said the atmosphere changed drastically when he arrived. He took charge of the camp. He had a relationship with the commandant. He was a doctor for the men. Many of the men in their journals, Mr. Bainbridge, who wrote a book, mentions Mr. Stanley. Hank Friedman mentions him, William Buzzier. So he had a big impact on the men. In fact, on the eve of the camp being liberated, the Germans told Captain Morgan, "We're going to evacuate." And Captain Morgan said, "We can't. These men are not strong enough. They're too weak to leave this camp." So he had a meeting that night with his barracks leaders and told them in the morning at formation, when they tell us that we're having to march out, I want you to pick certain men and they're going to drop to the ground, feigned illness. And that's what they did. And the commandant said, fine, and left them there. However,
amazing figure. But it's interesting. As soon as I saw the photo, I knew the story, and I was looking it up while you were talking there. And yeah, he was captured and normally and escaped and captured again. And according to a website, he was at a doctor after being captured in the Netherlands. So in between the Netherlands and your story, he was at a POW hospital in Obermarsfeld, and he's mentioned quite a few times in Ian Gardner's fantastic "Tonight We Die as Men" book about the 3rd Battalion 506. So yeah, it's amazing how sometimes, I'm talking about one subject and something happens where it connects the dots of another story. It's Yeah, people get around. Stanley Moore was one of
Oh
those
yeah.
legendary soldiers, very influential, incredible surgeon, but incredible kind of diplomat and ambassador and father figure to people. Yeah, what a legendary guy.
Well, good. So another man who wasn't, but supported 106 was a guy named Samuel E. Harris. He was one of 87 members of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion captured in the Bulge. And a couple reasons. Not only did he contribute to the story of the 106th, but after the last presentation, one of your viewers asked a question about the 333rd. On the eve, the night before the camp was liberated, Mr. Harris had enough, and he wanted to escape, and several of them were going to escape. And during his attempt, he was shot and killed. The next day, the camp was liberated. Now, according to the National Archives, as I said, there are 87 members who were of the 333rd who were captured. According to the National Archives, only 4 men died after capture. However, obviously, that does not include the 11 from Werworth, Belgium, who were summarily executed on December 17th. So for those that are familiar with Werworth, Belgium, and the 11 members of the 333rd who were executed, Mr. Harris was from the same unit, the same battalion. So this is Mr. Buzzier again. This is his liberated camera that he got. So you can see Mr. Buzzier on the right, healthy. This is before the battle. He doesn't have a CIB on, his combat infantry badge. And that in the bottom center, that's Mr. Buzzier there. It was over 45% of his body weight he lost. I can identify all of these men. You can see hanging around their neck, they have their U.S. dog tag and their POW
The creaky
dog
one.
tag
Yeah.
hanging out. So, as I said, at Stalag 4B, there were many Arbeitskommandos that went out. At Stalag 9B, there was only one. This is Johann Kasten. He was in 110th, 28th Infantry Division. He was the man of confidence at Stalag 9B. So the man of confidence is the go-between between the commandant and the enlisted men. Generally, in his case too, they could speak German. So Mr. Kasten, here's a picture again of Stalag 9B, and at the bottom you see the Jewish barracks. Mm-hmm. Prior to the NCOs leaving, the Germans segregated the Jews to this barrack. There were over 100 of them. For some reason, though, when the NCOs left Stalag 9B to go to Stalag 9A, it was more important to the Germans to follow military order, and the Jewish NCOs were allowed to leave to go to Stalag 9A, which probably saved their lives. There was over 70 Jewish POWs left in Barracks 32. The commandant insisted from Kasten that he disclose more Jewish POWs. Mr. Kasten's response was, we're all Americans. In addition, when the International Red Cross minister came by to inspect the camp, the commandant took Mr. Kasten aside and said, listen, don't complain. I don't want you complaining about the conditions of the camp, the food, the bedding, the blankets, no pillows, no lights. The Geneva Convention dictated what the wattage of light should be in each barracks. So Mr. Kasten had a private meeting with the minister. He asked the minister, is this confidential? The minister said, oh, sure. And the minister wrote everything down after this meeting. The minister, Mr. Kasten, go to the commandant's office, and the minister pulls out his notepad and starts rattling off all the complaints of Mr. Kasten. So Mr. Kasten was in the doghouse. The one arbeitskommando that left Stalag 9B was 350 men that went to Berga, and they left February 8th of 45. Now, there were only 70-some Jews. They took all the Jews, and then they took what, according to some, those who looked Jewish, who sounded Jewish, who had Jewish names, and troublemakers. And they sent them to Berga. This is an actual that's the list of the arbeitskommando. The third name down is Mr. Kasten. So from Berga, from Bad Orb, they travel to the west to Berga. It's about 150 miles. They travel by train. And in Berga, it is truly a slave labor camp. The men are charged with digging tunnels. There's 17 tunnels being dug into the side of a mountain using jackhammers and dynamite. They're being starved. They're being whipped. They're in there with the dust after the explosion. They arrived there February 28th, and by April 5th, 24 of them are dead. Only one of them that I'm aware of who was shot. Actually, Kasten and 3 others escaped, and they were caught in a nearby village, and they were sent back. But 24 men in that short time at Berga had died. So now the Soviets are getting closer, and the Germans abandoned Berga and marched the men south. Now, these men couldn't just march. The ones who couldn't walk, which were many, were in the back of a truck. Others did walk. They traveled 28 miles from Berga to where they were liberated. By the time they were liberated, Anthony Acevedo, I have here, he was in the 7th Infantry Division. He was a medic. He kept track of all the men who died. He provided aid to the men. 78, he had in his journal, 78 men had died of the 350 that went to Berga. What he wasn't aware of is that there were 2 men from the 106th who, the night before they were liberated, didn't stay in the barn. They wanted to escape, so they slept in under a bale of hay, and the following morning, some Hitler youth executed them. So 80 of the men, 80 of the 350 men who went to Berga died after their capture. These are some of the survivors of Berga. The gentleman on the right is James Watkins. He was in the 423rd. What can you say? I mean, it's obvious. Yeah. And one of the other things, there's a war crimes tribunal that documents this very well, interviewing. In fact, they interviewed the German commandant who was with them the entire way. Every day, either every night, there would be men who died in the back of the truck. They would bury them on the side of the road. They would stop for the night when they would get up in the morning, sleeping in a barn. It's somebody's, they would just commandeer somebody's barn. They would get up in the morning to go, and there'd be men dead, and they would just bury them along the route. Virtually every day during that march, a man died. And that time period from Bad Orb to the men's liberation after Berga was 75 days. Mm. So what I told you, I think you might feel is unique about the 106. I'm going to wrap it up here, that there were about 94,000 American POWs in Germany. 7,001 of them were from the 106th. Most of them, the 423rd and the 422nd. There were about 450 from the 424th that were captured. There are about 1,121 Americans who died after capture. It's about 1.12%. However, if you were from the 106, that nearly tripled. About 3% of the men captured from the 106 died and didn't make it home. And I say no less than 199 men of the 106 died after capture, which is nearly 18% of the total men who died of the 1,121. And when I say near or no less than 199%, these are figures I got from the National Archives, and right. I'm not certain if they're accurate. And I'll give you one example. I've documented, verified that 102 men from the 423rd died. But when you put this query in on the NARA's website, it only shows 64 men from the 423rd died, which I know is not true. All those other figures from the other units are ones that I got from the NARA. And personally, I believe that the number is higher than 199.
Yeah.
So Paul, like I said, I think
Well, I mean,
the start to the end at the 106 was unique, and I don't know if you agree or not.
no,
but
it's absolutely it's shattered the illusion that we sometimes have from films like The Great Escape and the other ones, where being a POW is a bit of a lark to some extent, and it's fit young people with love, in huts with bedding and lighting, and you just get a ticking off if you try and outwit the Germans. This has been a very brutal but important presentation. Well, we have a few questions. So that last period there, the last camps you were talking about. So Jim is asking, at this point, do we have any idea how much food the guards are getting? Because that is one of the stories. We've done presentations before where on like the death marches, for this a show with Holly Harris about the 8th Air Force, is that there's actually like almost a camaraderie between the German guards on the death marches and the prisoners themselves, because no one's got any food, and they're kind of sharing it with it, and they're to some extent they're helping each other along on the march. But that's a sort of separate story. But in terms of the camps you've researched, the guards aren't getting much either, are they?
No, I mean none of the Germans. Between the lack of supply and logistics. I'm certain at the camps, the guards were probably eating better. But one thing that I find interesting is there are a lot of Red Cross parcels, ones that did make it to the camps, and the Germans allowed the Americans to have them. They didn't, the German guards didn't take their Red Cross parcels. But like I said, it's the logistics. The International Red Cross couldn't get the parcels to the POW camps. Many of these men, and they write in their journals, 10 of us had to share a Red Cross parcel. Well, a Red Cross parcel was, I believe, for one man for 1 week, and 10 would have to share it. They would, cut the loaves of bread up, try to share them,
and that answers the second, because Andreas asked, I guess at this point the Red Cross parcels could not be distributed, so you've answered that as well. So, and John Sarabi added about the fact that the Reichsbahn is collapsing. So, as I started off there, that this part of the war is the worst time to be a prisoner to some extent of the Third Reich, and there's also been comments in the sidebar about the Germans are clearly absolutely on the brink of defeat now, but they're still singling out the Jews. They're still trying to carry on the ideology. They just keep doubling down. I mean, if ever you need any more reasons to hate the Nazis, these kind of examples of them still being cruel, still going to the lengths to separate people and murder people, when it's all nearly over. They're gonna lose the war. It's just so depressing.
So just to that issue, many of the POWs I talked to, some of them who were Jewish threw away their dog tags. Others didn't want to, because if you didn't have your dog tag, that could cause you problems. If you were captured, you could be considered a spy. Others wanted to keep them because if they died, they wanted their family to know. Others would chew the H for Hebrew on their dog tag. But Stalag 9B is the only camp that I'm aware of where that I've seen to where they segregated the Jews and sent the Jews off like that. So,
I mean, it's one of those things that, we go down a massive, great rabbit hole. Is some of the Oflags and the Stalags I read about that have been kind of organized by the captors themselves. That obviously the Germans are in charge, but the Germans in some camps have got to the point where, because they're looking after so many tens of thousands of people, they kind of let the prisoners to some extent manage the infrastructure themselves. And then, as you said, in most of the camps, they kind of kept the Jewish members secret. They kept some people who were high profile prisoners who may have had more commandos, and they managed to kind of secrete them within that. And some of the aviators who were shot down were given kind of cover stories. But in this case, that obviously they went to that extra degree, which was particularly tragic in this case. The next question for you is from Ben. Could you talk to the last show, Brian, about the memorials and you going to the Ardennes there? So Benjamin is asking, are there any memorials or museums at the sites Brian has mentioned? So people have been busy checking on Google Earth for the remnants of some of these camps, but do you know if any of them have memorials?
Oh yeah. So my wife and I were just over there, and again, I mentioned Karl Worters, the Belgian who
Yeah.
lives over there. He's really spearheaded. There are many memorials around in Schoenberg, in St. Vith, all around St. Vith, just about where every unit they're trying to put. And forgive me, I forgot. I can't think of Doug's last name right now. Doug's an American from the north west U.S. who lives in Germany.
I know who you mean, but I can't think either.
Oh, hopefully you do, because I don't want Doug to be upset with me here. But his name slips my mind. But Doug and Carl are putting these memorials up. They just put, I think it was a memorial. I was there at the rededication. It was, I think it was the 14th Cav memorial. But there are memorials all over. I don't know of any museums, but there are a lot of memorials.
Good. Thanks for that. I'll try and find the name out while you ask. Another question we had
Mitchell. Doug Mitchell.
Doug Mitchell is the graves. Those prisoners. I mean, obviously there were lots of different locations you mentioned today about where people were buried, but have those who were shot or executed or died of malnutrition as prisoners of war? They've obviously been. Some were repatriated and some are in the cemeteries in Germany. Is that correct? Or Netherlands?
Well,
Belgium.
I don't know about a cemetery in Germany like Edward Crone. His body was exhumed and took back. There are many. I mean, the stories of the men who died in the John Ahn, a man who died, and his mother spent 8 years trying to find his body. She sent pictures all over. She hired a German investigator. There was others who died in strafings. As far as I know, the men on the march to Berga, those bodies were found. In fact, I got photographs of their graves. But they're in the battle there. I know from the 423rd, I believe there are 3 men who were not captured and their body was not found. But yeah, there's still quite a few over there.
Mm. Well, I mean, absolutely brilliant stuff. The last comment I'm going to leave is is praise for you and praise for me as well from Nathan, who's been on one of my World War II TV tours. So Nathan says, Woody, as always, thank you for providing us with such an excellent guest. Your channel is unlike anything else available. And he's also said earlier he's buying the book despite his ever-growing bookshelves and people getting into book debt over World War II TV. But as you said at the beginning, and it is a chapter that is overlooked a little bit. The American infantry POW experience. We talk about the pilots and the aviators a bit, and we talk a lot about the British. But this chapter, and I kept thinking of a diary I had, which I've since given back to the family, of Bill Chandler, who was 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron, captured at Arnhem, and I had his POW diary. I forget which camp he was in now. But here's a guy who, before going into Arnhem, was all, piss and vinegar, wants to go and defeat the Third Reich. He's optimistic. He's hopeful about everything. And his diary, and he was prisoner from September to liberate in 44 to liberation. You just see this guy descending into a deep depression, and the writing gets more depressed and more, the 4 walls, so to speak, and then liberation again. He does a couple more pages before he goes back home. And you can see the elation of being liberated, but to kind of understand what happened to these young men and who were incarcerated for a very, as we found out, a very eventful few weeks and months. It's been really revealing. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you for letting me talk about the men of the 106th.
Brilliant. Well, folks, I'm back again tomorrow, usual time with Seth from Unauthorized History of the Pacific. We're talking about what happened in the Pacific Theater sort of after VE Day, whether it made a difference with more resources going down to the Pacific. We'll find out tomorrow. And then I've got nothing on Friday. I might do an Ask Me Anything, I might not. And then my coverage over the D-Day period, because there's ceremonies and things, will be a little bit patchy, but then I will start up again in kind of the second week of June. But thanks for everybody for your questions and comments. As always, click like and subscribe and buy my guest books. But I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.